This is They Create Worlds, episode 215, Final Fantasy VII. Welcome to They Create Worlds. I'm Jeffrey, and I'm joined by my co-host, Alex.
Hello.
Today, we don't get to talk about a game franchise, or even where it came from, or how the right side managed to buy out the good side, or the bad side. Who knows anymore? But we're just skipping through 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. No one cares about that. We're going directly to 7. Because apparently that's the only one that people remember.
Well, I don't know if I'd go that far, but I think it's fair to say that it is certainly one of the most celebrated entries in the Final Fantasy series, and was also a pivotal title in Sony's rise to dominance of the world video game scene. So it's also in many ways probably the most important title in the Final Fantasy series as well.
So you're saying that not only was it full of 3D and music and some unfortunate deaths, it actually has a much greater story than us just rehashing, here's stuff that you could have seen in the playthrough.
Oh, absolutely. It's an incredibly important game in the history of video games. So, yeah.
So how do we start this tale? We know the PlayStation's out. It's been out for how long?
Well, 3 years when the game's released. 2.5 years.
2.5, 3 years into its release. So what is it about Final Fantasy VII that really helped propel not only the widespread adoption and normalization of RPGs into the mainstream consciousness, let alone how does it really make it so that Sony is the predominant console, especially of that era, and really cementing their foothold as far as everything else is concerned? It can't just be the Japanese side of things, because Final Fantasy's always struggled in Japan. Dragon Quest usually is the one that's most popular over there, but we do know Final Fantasy is more popular outside of Japan. How does all of this tie in?
Well, in order to understand that, we really have to start back before Final Fantasy VII and really spend a little bit of time talking about Final Fantasy VI, actually, without which a lot of this transition wouldn't have happened. Because Final Fantasy VI represented a sort of passing of the torch on this series. Final Fantasy, of course, had been conceived by Hironobu Sakaguchi, legendary game developer. We talk all about that in our Final Fantasy episode, where we talk about the origin of the series and about the first game. By the beginning of the 1990s, Sakaguchi is in a singular position at Square. A position very unusual for a developer at a Japanese company, where he is on the board of directors, is a very influential figure in management, but at the same time is also a game developer and is primarily driving game development. There have been other Japanese developers that have been put into relatively high-level management positions at other companies, but even when that happens, most of the time their influence is limited. But Sakaguchi was basically able, by the beginning of the 1990s, based on the success of Final Fantasy to the company, was basically able to do whatever the heck he wanted. He had the ear of the founder of the company, Masafumi Miyamoto, and was trusted implicitly when it came to matters of game development. What this also meant, however, is that he was getting increasingly busy. He couldn't really devote as much attention to the Final Fantasy series, specifically in the creation of the games, as he used to be able to. As the 90s progressed, he started pulling back. Starting about 1991, he started pulling back from the everyday development. He was still the producer of the Final Fantasy games, and he still exerted a lot of influence on them. He wasn't completely detached, but he was no longer the primary driver. By Final Fantasy VI, he was ready to pass the torch entirely, and he actually stepped back from directing duties and handed the keys to the kingdom over to two individuals, Hiroki Ito, who focused on the battle system, and Yoshinori Kitase, who focused on the story and the scenario and the characters and all of this stuff. This is why we really have to start with Final Fantasy VI, because this is the real coming out of the man who primarily shaped Final Fantasy VII, which is not Hironobu Sakaguchi, but is in fact Yoshinori Kitase.
So you're telling me that really with Final Fantasy VI, we really have Kitase is the one I get to celebrate and love for such memorable scenes as there is sand on my boots and certain kinds of laughter of maniacalness.
Indeed. But also things like the opera, Celis's dramatic suicide attempt on the cliff, all the cinematics surrounding things like Locke's tragic story with Rachel or Setzer's tragic story with Daryl. A lot of that and the presentation of that is coming from Kitase. And the thing is that this is no accident because Kitase had been a filmmaker and his real passion had been filmmaking. As a kid, I mean, he was a kid before video games, but as a kid, he was interested in comic books. He spent a lot of time playing outdoors, all of this kind of stuff. And then Star Wars came out in 1978 in Japan. Obviously 77, but it was 78 in Japan. This just gave him an entirely new perspective on life because most sci-fi before Star Wars, there were a couple of exceptions, but most sci-fi before Star Wars was very, very fake. The special effects were very, very bad.
As someone who likes old movies like that, yeah.
But, of course, Star Wars, Industrial Light and Magic for Star Wars, invented so many new techniques for doing photography with models and miniatures and compositing them into a shot to make them look absolutely believable and real. These days, it may be passé for someone who didn't grow up with this stuff to watch the opening of the first Star Wars movie when you see the Star Destroyer just endlessly coming across the screen. But that was something no one had ever seen before in a movie, and it blew a lot of people away. And Kitase was one of those people that was absolutely blown away by that.
I certainly know the one in Spaceballs was certainly longer.
Yes. That's when Kitase decided to become a filmmaker. He went to film school, and when he graduated, he got a job at a small production house, film production house. They primarily focused on advertisements and short videos. It wasn't feature film, but it was a start. It was this same time period that he also really did start becoming interested in video games, and particularly was exposed to Dragon Quest. Again, Dragon Quest, even though it's fairly passé today, even compared to other JRPGs, Dragon Quest was one of the first games that truly captured the imagination of the Japanese public by telling a story, as basic as that story was. It did have a narrative, and it did transport you into this whole other universe. And, it's not the first game that did any of those things, obviously. The combination of all of the factors that went into it, and we have a Dragon Quest episode too, if you want more information on that, just caught the attention of the Japanese public in a major way, and that included Kitase. He then discovered Final Fantasy when Final Fantasy came out, so he was a big fan of that too. He was very interested in the more narrative kinds of games as befit his status as a filmmaker. Well, the company he was working at was really not satisfying him because he did want to be in feature film style production, and the company that he worked for was all advertisements and shorts and whatnot. After I think about a year at the company, he decided to quit. He decided to leave. It wasn't fulfilling him. He was fully intending to get another job in the film industry. But then he saw an ad for Square and was intrigued and interviewed and ended up going to Square and getting into the video game industry instead. But he never lost that filmmaking ambition. That really shows there's a real change in Final Fantasy VI, in my opinion. It's really the start of what we see in Final Fantasy VII as well. At this time, JRPGs, and some of this was technology, but it wasn't all technology. Some of it was just lack of imagination. JRPGs, love them to death. I loved the early Final Fantasy games, the early Dragon Quest games, as you did as well, Jeffrey. But most of the action in these games during the storytelling and whatnot really was, here's a character over here, text box, text box, text box, text box. Here's a character over here, all very static, text box, text box, text box. And that's what's going on. Now, you had a few exceptions. I mean, Final Fantasy IV, obviously, you had the opening scene with the Red Wings cruising to Mysidia, or the scene that I know Jeffrey liked quite a bit, where the Giant of Babel wakes up and everyone joins forces to try to take it down. I mean, it wasn't completely lacking in cinematic touches, but for the most part, there were not a lot of cinematic touches in RPGs at that time.
You had a little bit of the emotion that was going on that you could see in the characters themselves. Oh, I feel sad, so all of them look down, or something like that.
Right.
I'm excited, so they'll wave their hands around and stuff. While that was used, it wasn't used effectively. You had some of it there, like Tella fighting Edward just after Anna died in Final Fantasy IV.
Right.
Where Edward would slowly back away as this angry man's coming right at him. I think I can see where you're coming from here, where the shift there really changes with Final Fantasy VI. Not only do you have some of those emotes going on and the text boxes, but you actually have the camera panning while that's going on. That helps give a greater sense of scene to the game.
No, absolutely. And, sometimes props being used, like Celis with Locke's bandana during the suicide attempt, or, throwing the bouquet off the tower during the opera. Just the fact that there was an opera.
Flipping the coin in Figaro.
Yeah, the coin flip in Figaro, that's a fantastic example. There were way more of these cinematic touches, or even the opening walk to Narshe while the credits are rolling with Terran, Biggs, and Wedge just walking across the snow plains as Uematsu's music, Terra's theme, Tina's theme, is playing in the background.
That's a really great way of using that cinematic touch, where you're using Mode 7 on the Super Nintendo to really tell this story and give you a sense of, okay, kids, you're going into a world where there's snow, where there's these magical steampunk suits of armor, and there's these people from somewhere who are trying to get in there and get some sort of Esper, whatever the heck that is.
Indeed.
You're walking to it, and you got this beautiful music. What better way to set a scene to sort of like draw you in and say, I want to grab your attention and really bring you into this. That's why a lot of movies and TV shows usually start and end with something really poignant to go, oh, I want to vest my interest in here and see what happens next. Or when something ends, it wants to go, oh, I want to know what happens next in the next episode or in the next movie because I have this little teaser at the end. That's why they do that. So this is a great way of using that same kind of thing. They did that with Final Fantasy IV. They did that with Final Fantasy V. But here is the first time that we're doing it in a cinematic way where we're not just throwing you into there. That's a great hook. That's a good start. But here we are using Mode 7 to just really make you go, oh my gosh, I had no clue the Super Nintendo could even do this. If this is how they're starting it, what more does this game have to offer me?
Absolutely. And of course, some of that is just getting a better handle on the hardware. But a lot of it, I think, has to be Kitase's eye as a filmmaker and wanting to bring a different level of cinematic presentation. And that's really the starting point for what's going on in Final Fantasy VII as well. I mean, you can only get so cinematic on the Super NES just because of the limitations of the hardware. But I really, in my opinion, as someone who loves 6 and 7, it's often a coin flip for me. It's like, what's my mood today? Which one I like more. They're far and away my two favorite, not counting the MMO 14. I really feel like I can see the beginning of that philosophy that drives 7 and the games that follow 7 that get progressively more cinematic, for better or for worse. I really feel you can see the start of that in Final Fantasy VI. It's just slightly obscured by the fact that the hardware can only accomplish so much. I think it's no coincidence that this is, Kitase did work on 5 as well, but, 6 is really the one where Sakaguchi stepped back and said, okay, Kitase, this is yours now. I don't think that is a coincidence at all.
If this is where he's cutting his teeth, that's him getting full reign to play with the stuff at the end of the hardware cycle. They go and say, hello, Final Fantasy VII with this PlayStation with 3D graphics and all this crazy stuff I can do. That's why you have the epic intro scene of Final Fantasy VII.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same kind of thing. I want to draw you in. I have full reign to take advantage of this hardware. I'm going to have this full 3D pan around this big city. So you go, I thought this was a Final Fantasy game. What's this big circular city here with big fancy lights? Oh, there's trains here? Well, I guess I like trains. I had some guy suplex one once.
Indeed.
We can continue on. We're going from movie right into the action. We're jumping off the train. We are here. Here's the bad guy. He's coming right for us. I need to press some X buttons.
Exactly. And we're going to get back to that a little bit because you brought up another very important point there, though not quite ready to go into depth yet on the transitions between different types of action in Final Fantasy VII. Again, that is entirely a Kitase's ambition. The other thing about Final Fantasy VI that really informs what happens in 7 is it is also the point where there gets to be broader contribution into the world building of whatever world the Final Fantasy game is taking place in, because of course each one takes place in its own fully realized world. In the past, we talked about in Final Fantasy, Sakaguchi did not come up with everything himself in that game. There were other members of the team that were also doing that, but that's a whole different generation of Square people. And underneath Kitase, you have another generation of Square people that are coming up and taking a more prominent role in Final Fantasy VI, because kind of the goal that they had for 6, kind of the main theme of 6, was to not focus on a single protagonist, but to consciously create a game where basically everyone is the hero. You can point to any character, not counting the couple of, secret hidden characters that they put in the game for fun. You could point to virtually any character in the game and say, that's the protagonist. Obviously, some have more story than others, but they consciously gave everybody some story. And they gave multiple characters big chunks of story. You might think at the beginning of the game that Tara, or Tina in the original Japanese, is the protagonist of the story because she factors so much at the beginning. But she starts fading back after she discovers she's half Esper, and she kind of leaves the story for a while. Then there's a lot of focus on Locke. There's a lot of focus on Celis. Then, even though they don't have as much story devoted to them, you have big backstories for Setzer and for Gaw and for Cian and all of these characters. Then, in the World of Ruin, which, again, they did, and this is something that's very big in Final Fantasy VII as well, they're really big on subverting tropes. I don't know if that comes specifically from Kitase or if it comes from the entire team, but another goal of both 6 and 7 was subverting tropes. One trope that was very common in these games is that big bad threatens world, hero rises up, hero saves world in nick of time. They were like, let's turn this on its head. What happens if the hero doesn't save the world in the nick of time and the world blows up? So they have the World of Ruin section to subvert that trope. But then in the World of Ruin, it becomes very open-ended where after you recruit a couple of characters that you're required to recruit through the story, they turn you loose and you can recruit as many or as few of the characters back into your party as you want, not counting those initial characters that have to be part of the party. That was for the same reason. This was a whole there is no main protagonist kind of thing, and we want players to go out and get the characters that they particularly resonated with, and if there were characters that the player did not resonate with, then it's okay if they don't get that character. And then, of course, this is all wrapped up at the end with that 15-minute long credit sequence where every single character gets a moment of recognition, assuming you recruited them into your party, and a final little beat at the very end as everyone's leaving the final dungeon after defeating Kefka.
I believe that's very true. Terra is used really as a catalyst to draw everyone else together.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But there's nothing particular about her to say that I am the hero. She's not like Cecil from Final Fantasy IV,
right,
where it's like everything revolves around him and his journey to turn from darkness to light and then redeem himself. 6 is really, who do you resonate with? I think it's very telling that different people will resonate with different characters. We have friends who grew up loving this game. Our friend Steve, he really identified it with Setzer.
Mm-hmm.
Our friend Matt, he really identified with Sabin.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure which character you most resonated with.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I mean, I would say the story of Locke and Celis, and particularly Celis, just because she's in an opera. And, also the very dramatic opening to the World of Ruin, where I definitely never saved Sid, because saving Sid was no fun. He's just like, oh, you saved me. Here's a boat. Go find people. Much more dramatic if you let him die.
True. I imagine if our parents knew about that particular scene, there might be questions. Why is this game geared towards children, talking about deep, dark things where people are attempting suicide and all this other dark stuff that's going on in this game? Final Fantasy VI is a lot darker when you really look at it as an adult.
Indeed.
As for myself, I'm not sure which character I most identified with. I've always loved Kefka as a villain.
Yeah, same
absolutely
here.
Adore him as a villain. As far as one of the intended protagonists, it's kind of up in the air where I would fall if I had to sit down and give that thought, which is not even the game we're talking about here, so... but it's all
connected. And, it's all connected, and the reason I bring this up is because they had to develop so much story around so many characters that Kitase was not doing this all by himself. He was giving everyone an opportunity to contribute ideas, and then Kitase served as the clearinghouse to decide which ideas they would take. And so he kind of gave carte blanche to other people on the team to develop characters, to develop story beats, even to develop world-building elements that he would then incorporate into the final kind of coherent script. One of the individuals that ended up having a particular knack for that was an artist by the name of Tetsuya Nomura. A name that, of course, is very big in Square Enix circles now, most prominently for the Kingdom Hearts series. He was just an artist primarily working on the monsters in Final Fantasy VI, but because of this open environment where everybody was allowed to pitch ideas, he was also able to get some of his ideas into the game. The idea of Magitech. He didn't design every aspect of it, but just the basic idea of this way that magic and technology coexist in a world was his idea, for instance. Setzer and Shadow were characters that he developed. He wasn't the only one that was developing things in Final Fantasy VI, but he was recognized as a particularly valuable contributor, which started him on the path to being more than just an artist, but also having input into development beyond the art style, which is something that's also going to play a pretty big role in Final Fantasy VII as well. I know we've spent like nearly half an hour talking about Final Fantasy VI, and our topic of conversation here is Final Fantasy VII, but it really all starts here. It starts with the more cinematic approach. It starts with Kitase taking greater control over things. It starts with Nomura being recognized as a good ideas man that can help develop a world and a setting and characters. All of this stuff that's going on in 6 is part of what is going to make Final Fantasy VII the game it becomes. So there's a lot of contradictory information out there about the early days of Final Fantasy VII. What hardware it started on, when it started, what ideas were being pursued, what tech demos may or may not have had something to do with the final product of Final Fantasy VII. We do need to spend a decent chunk of time kind of unraveling that. And in that, we are greatly helped by the oral history that was done several years ago by Matt Leone for Polygon and then expanded into a full book. This oral history, despite the fact that he interviewed a great number of people, is not completely comprehensive, quite frankly. Our episode here today is not just going to be a rehash of his oral history, far from it. But he definitely did a better job than anyone else of untangling some of these questions about the very early days of the development of the game. And so we're definitely indebted to that oral history for a lot of this background material. There were a couple of false starts in beginning a Final Fantasy VII. Right after Final Fantasy VI, the team, Kitase and Sakaguchi and all of them, or a small number of them, Nomura as well, moved on to beginning to create a Final Fantasy VII as another game on the Super Famicom. We have a little bit of information about this from Kitase, from Nomura. Sakaguchi, surprisingly, doesn't really remember anything about this, at least not in the oral history that Leon did. We know that this one apparently was going to be in a more modern setting. They talk about how they were experimenting setting it in New York City. Other sources indicate that some of the ideas that were originally mooted for this version of the game were eventually used for Parasite Eve instead, another PlayStation RPG by Square that is set in New York City. Don't know how much of that is actually accurate, but it is true that they started with this, in about 1994 or so, they started with this concept of doing another Super Famicom game. 6 had been very successful in Japan, not particularly successful outside of Japan, as was always the case with JRPGs in this time period. But it had been the most successful by far of the Final Fantasy games in Japan. They weren't quite catching Dragon Quest, but they were a lot closer to them. So they moved right along to do the next one. But at that point, not long after, they had to completely halt because there was another game, a little game called Chrono Trigger, that was under development, and it was in deep, deep trouble. So they basically needed to shift all resources to this Chrono Trigger game and abandon their concept for some kind of follow-up Final Fantasy game number 7 on the Super Famicom. There's really no link. I mean, there were some of the same people like Kitase and Nomura were working on these initial concepts, but there's really no link between whatever work was being done at that time and what we eventually got as Final Fantasy VII, because Chrono Trigger just completely halted that development, and then by the time they were done with Chrono Trigger, it was very clear that wherever Final Fantasy VII was going to be, it was not going to be on the Super Famicom. It was going to be on a newer hardware. Now, there's another thread that's going on at the same time as this, which is one of the things that kind of confuses people about the timeline of all of this. At the same time as this Final Fantasy VII stuff is getting started, and then Chrono Trigger is being developed, and then all of this stuff, Square is also beginning to experiment with next-generation technology. Not a specific system, but just next-generation technology in general. Because it's very clear that the next generation is going to be a step up, that we're going to be getting into computer graphics. I mean, it's technically all computer graphics, but what the Japanese call CG or computer graphics, which is more of an idea of 3D rendering when Japanese developers use the term. They know that it's going to be getting more into polygonal work, and nobody at the company has any idea how to work with that stuff. And this is a problem across the video game industry, and we've talked about this occasionally. The jump from 2D to 3D was absolutely huge for every company because from a computer graphics perspective, pixel art and animation is done very differently than three-dimensional art. It's not just different programs, it's completely different styles. You can be the most brilliant pixel artist in the world and absolute rubbish at doing 3D graphics. I mean, some people can do both. But they are such distinct skill sets that you can be a very talented 2D artist or animator and get a hold of a 3D animation program and have no idea what you're doing. So at the same time this is going on, Square is looking to the future and is looking for the direction that the industry is going to go. So they've bought some Silicon Graphics workstations.
It's always Silicon Graphics workstations, all these games.
Oh, yes. Yes, in this time period, it absolutely was, because they were the leader in graphics workstations. And of course, they had all the cachet from the fact that they were being used in movies like Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park, stuff we've talked about in some of our other episodes. They were the leader in graphics workstations. So they got some Onyx systems, and they hired a guy from a Japanese computer company called Symbolics by the name of Kazuyuki Hashimoto, who knew 3D graphics. He hadn't been in game design before, but this is a guy who knew 3D graphics, and they tasked him with starting to lead experiments, build tools, build pipelines for the company to be able to do 3D polygonal graphics, CG stuff, just with an eye towards understanding that this is the direction the industry is going. It's not working on a specific game, not working on a specific hardware, but just starting to figure out what this brand new three-dimensional CG world might look like. At the time, Square was still very, very wedded to Nintendo. And because Square was very wedded to Nintendo, and because Nintendo was using SGI technology, there has been a tendency to assume that the work Hashimoto was doing was specifically tied to early research to work on Nintendo's next console, Project Reality, which became the N64. That's a logical leap to make, but it's actually not what's going on here. They're really just playing around with an Onyx workstation. And yes, since the Project Reality uses Silicon Graphics hardware, there are some similarities, but the Onyx is way more powerful, and they're not doing these demos and this research to actually create something on the Onyx that could then be rendered down to a console, like when Rare was doing Donkey Kong Country and was rendering all of this stuff on an Onyx workstation and then shrinking it down, reducing it. This was just pure pie-in-the-sky research. In fact, according to Hashimoto and others at the company in Leon's oral history, Nintendo had been so vague and inconsistent on what the specs for their next console were going to be, because the Project Reality went through a long, tortured development, and the people at Silicon Graphics and Nintendo were struggling to figure out what exactly of that workstation technology they could economically put into a game console, that they specifically rejected trying at this point to do anything with Nintendo's prototype hardware because they could not be confident that the specs that they were being given today would actually match the system tomorrow. And indeed, we've gotten this from other interviews with other developers. There were times during the development of Project Reality when there were companies working on games and then Nintendo suddenly came to them and said, you know how we said you would have this much memory? Or you know how we said the processor would have this clock speed? Well, we lied. So, I mean, they were very right not to focus. I know I'm kind of driving this point into the ground a little bit, but since this is one of the kind of myths about the early development of Final Fantasy VII, I thought it was worth kind of going into a little detail about what Square was really doing and kind of what the chaos was in the development of Project Reality / the N64 at this time.
This is Project Reality, because we know that the PlayStation came out of Sony working with Nintendo.
Yeah, Sony's not in the picture at this point as far as Square's concerned.
So this is past that point where they broke off.
Oh, yeah, absolutely it is.
We're past that point. PlayStation's being developed or is already out via Sony, and then Nintendo just going, and we're doing the N64 now.
Exactly. We're past all of that drama.
We're past that point, so we're not at some sort of like weird ether space a la Secret of Mana where, oh, we know this hardware's coming down. Then, oh, it's not.
Yeah, exactly. It's not like that. It's not like that. This work is going on in like 1994, 1995, after all of this has already happened. As part of this research, Hashimoto and his team decide to make a graphical demo of what a next-generation RPG battle might look like. So they actually take some of the characters from Final Fantasy VI and create a tech demo, a playable tech demo, of a battle with the Esper Golem from the game in this new kind of 3D thing that they're working with. Again, not tied to any specific hardware. And then they take it to SIGGRAPH in 1995, the big computer graphics conference, and show it off to the world. So again, there's been a lot of talk about how, oh, well, this is proof that they were already working on creating the next Final Fantasy for Nintendo's hardware because they have this demo running on Silicon Graphics hardware. And you see, this is basically the beginning of the engine of Final Fantasy VII. Well, no. A, it's not. It's its own separate tech demo. There was no attempt to make this viable on a weaker platform. It was taking full advantage of the hardware it was using and not doing something like Donkey Kong Country where they're rendering it down to something usable by a cheaper console. And B, this is not tied to Nintendo hardware. They're using Silicon Graphics workstations because everyone's using Silicon Graphics workstations for this advanced work. Not because this is an early hint that they're going to be working on Project Reality.
I actually have the article in question up. There are some pictures in there. I'll, of course, throw this all in the show notes. But if you really look closely at all of the few scenes they do have, in my mind at least, this is something akin to a PlayStation 2, not the original PlayStation in terms of graphical fidelity, shadows, lighting effects, texturing, everything. That makes sense to me that they're using, we have this workstation that can do all the things, let's have it do all the things.
Yes. Now, that being said, just to complicate our story even more, This tech demo and the work Hashimoto is doing has nothing to do with creating the next Final Fantasy on the Project Reality on the Nintendo 64. However, it is also true that at the same time this was going on, Kitase and Nomura and a small team are getting together once again and beginning to do preliminary work on Final Fantasy VII, which at this point is understood to probably be appearing on Nintendo hardware. So it's like there's a bunch of different things. There's this initial attempt to do Final Fantasy VII immediately after Final Fantasy VI on the Super Famicom. There's the tech demo using Final Fantasy VI characters that was demonstrated at SIGGRAPH. And then you also do have the beginnings of fooling around with creating a Final Fantasy VII, probably on a Nintendo system. And it's just that these things get muddled and mixed together, and the story gets a little lost. But one thing Leon's oral history definitely did very well was kind of get to the bottom of what was going on with these individual projects here at the beginning. It's at this point we should really turn our attention to, of course, the great controversy, which was Square defecting from Nintendo. There's a story that's been told about this as well, and that story is largely true, but there is a bit more nuance to it, and so we want to talk about that a little bit. First of all, it should be said that Square was basically a second party of Nintendo at this point.
A la Rare?
Yeah. I mean, they weren't an actual second party. Nintendo did not own a huge chunk of them. But they, for all intents and purposes, operated as a second party. They were super close to Nintendo, super loyal to Nintendo. Not long before this, they had opened an American branch, an American development branch, and they opened that in Seattle so they could be close to Nintendo. They were even working on Super Mario RPG. They had even been entrusted by Nintendo with the characters from the Mario universe to create an RPG. There were no companies closer without an actual honest-to-God kind of ownership stake than Nintendo and Square in this time period.
Super Mario RPG was a beloved game for the Super Nintendo. It's fun, it's interesting, it's a different take on stuff, but it's well done, and there's plenty of people who enjoy it, and then it led on to other things like Paper Mario and all sorts of other stuff.
Absolutely.
They're this close. How do we have such a messy divorce?
Well, it entirely has to do with the ambitions of Square and the ambition of Kitase and the ambition of Sakaguchi on this game. The reason that usually gets bandied about comes down to the CD versus cartridge thing. There's a lot of truth to that. But we have to go into this story a little bit more. First of all, it's absolutely true that Kitase and Sakaguchi and all of them were looking towards the future, were looking towards 3D graphics. That's why Hashimoto was brought in and was starting to create these pipelines. They had great ambitions for Final Fantasy VII as an epic cinematic experience. Final Fantasy VI was doing everything it could to be cinematic, but it was limited by the hardware. Kitase did not want to be limited by hardware again. He wanted to be able to have something truly epic, truly cinematic, and he wanted to be able to seamlessly transition. You brought this up when describing the opening of Final Fantasy VII a few minutes ago, and I said that we'd return to it. One of his goals was he wanted to be able to seamlessly transition between cinematics, story, exploration, combat, etc. Just have everything blend together as much as possible, which is a remarkable feat when you think about it. And it was really difficult for them to do because you have this big CG opening, as you said, where we're zoomed in on Aerith and then pan out from Aerith to see the neighborhood she's in, and then the whole neighborhood, then the whole district, then the whole city, and then zoom back in on this train, which is all very impressive cinematic. But even more impressive is that then we move from that CG scene to having the polygonal cloud non-CG cutscene character on top of that train that's arriving and hopping off of it, and we're seamlessly into the game. And then the two guards come. Obviously, there has to be a small transition screen, but we're basically seamlessly into a battle. So we've moved from a cutscene to an exploration scene to a battle scene, all within the space of just a minute or so, and all of it seamless transition. That was very deliberate. This is what Kitase wanted to be able to do with this game, is to unify cinematic, story, action, combat as seamlessly as possible. And so that was going to take a lot of data, a lot of game data. It was going to require a medium that had some heft to it. That made CD very attractive. The other thing that made CD very attractive is everyone at Square realized that this game was going to be expensive, that realizing this dream was going to be expensive. They were afraid that if they had to charge too much for the game, because Final Fantasy VI weren't cheap. We both bought that game. We remember that. Final Fantasy VI were not cheap.
We're talking back in the 90s being charged $70, $75, $80 for one game.
Exactly.
Same thing with Chrono Trigger. Same thing with some of the other ones.
Exactly. So they were already pushing the bounds of what they thought that the majority of the public would be willing to shoulder in terms of cost on these things. They were afraid that if they stuck with a ROM-based cartridge media, that they were going to have to price this game so high that it was going to eat into sales. Yes, they'd be getting more per copy because they're charging more, but that wouldn't be enough to offset the amount of sales they'd be losing because it was so expensive, and they knew this game was going to be expensive to develop. So there was a very real fear amongst management about recouping their costs. It's absolutely true that the whole CD-ROM versus cartridge thing was a big part of the problem, but it's actually not the whole story, because after all, Nintendo was working on, for instance, the disk drive, the 64DD, which never came out in the United States. Obviously, they didn't know at the time what a troubled development that was going to have, but there was, in theory, the possibility that Nintendo would be able to, over time, provide them with storage solutions that would allow the game to run. The CD-ROM was a big part of it, but wasn't the whole story, because one thing that Leone found when he was interviewing people is that while most people talked about that, others were also talking about other technical problems with the system. Because, as it turns out, there were other extreme limitations to the Nintendo 64, despite the fact that in many ways it was a more advanced hardware than the PlayStation. The way it did graphics was actually not optimal for what Square wanted to do, because they were looking at creating very detailed characters, very detailed monsters, and one of the first tests they did was to render a behemoth, the enemy behemoth, classic enemy from the Final Fantasy series, to get a sense of what they were looking at in terms of polygon count and whatnot, and they created a behemoth that ended up being made out of 2,000 polygons. They ran that on the Sony hardware, and they ran that on the Nintendo hardware, and they discovered that on the Nintendo hardware, it did not run as well, that polygon count was too high. You might be thinking that's odd, because the N64 was a very robust system. It could actually, in theory, on paper, render more polygons per second than the PlayStation could. It had other problems, like the fact that it had 4 kilobytes for textures, which was a huge problem, but I thought on polygon rendering it was fine. Yeah, it could render a lot of polygons, but it had real frame rate issues because of the way the hardware was implemented. First of all, it used a cheaper form of RAM, RDRAM, to keep costs down, but had a much higher latency than regular DRAM did, which could cause some slowdowns. But the other thing is that the reality coprocessor in the system, and that's what they called it, the reality coprocessor, that served as a support chip to the CPU and even took on some of the functions of a GPU. It wasn't a full-blown GPU, but it took on some of those functions, unlike the chips in the PlayStation and the Saturn. Because of the complex way that reality coprocessor had to balance load, because it was the sole source through which the unified memory architecture funneled information. The CPU did not directly interface with the memory. It had to go through the reality coprocessor. And because of the complex pipeline it had to draw graphics, and because it also had to do the sound as well, the N64 did not have a dedicated sound chip, the reality coprocessor was prone to stalling, which basically means that it could not always continuously execute subroutines because there was a backlog elsewhere in the pipeline that caused it to miss its timing window, and it would basically lose cycles. As a result of that, it could take a real hit to frame rate. The other thing that was weird about the system is that the graphics portion of the reality coprocessor, the RSP, the signal processor in it, did not have hardwired instructions. It was actually configured via microcode. You had to actually load in some microcode in order to make the graphics go on the N64. Nintendo had a few different configurations of microcode that could be used to get varying effects, but the early microcode configurations had some real flaws to them, and Nintendo refused to provide the proprietary information necessary for companies to do their own microcode. So people were reliant on Nintendo's microcode, which in the beginning was not always optimal. So you put all of these things together, and the N64 actually, particularly in the very beginning, some of this stuff improved over time, had real problems with maintaining frame rate while drawing a large number of polygons. And indeed, there are a few, I don't have one off the top of my head, I could probably look it up, but there are a few games that are particularly polygon intensive or have particularly long draw distances that do suffer from slowdown because of all of these issues.
The Star Wars game comes to mind, Shadows of the Empire, I believe it's called.
Mm-hmm.
That one really suffers a lot from it. I mean, heck, even classics like GoldenEye and Perfect Dark really suffer.
Perfect Dark's a good example. Perfect Dark's one that's particularly nice. I want to say the second Turok game as well, though I could be mistaken. But yeah, there are actually some real slowdown issues with the hardware, despite the fact that it has a robust polygon rendering engine. The Square folks were not satisfied with the performance they were getting on their higher polygon count monsters like the Behemoth.
Heck, you even had the same problem with Nintendo official games. I can recall situations in the Water Palace of Ocarina of Time where there's significant slowdowns for certain events. There's significant slowdowns in Super Mario 64 in certain things, particularly, again, water levels.
Yep, exactly, where there's a lot going on. So they were not happy with the performance of the hardware. It's likely that even if Nintendo had gone with CD or provided some kind of solution like the disk drive that Square was satisfied with in terms of the storage capacity, that they would have still been unhappy because they were not happy with that performance they were getting when there were high polygon counts. And they were planning to use high polygon counts because they wanted this thing to be very impressive. There were a couple of reasons for them to be kind of upset with the Nintendo setup, but at the same time, in the beginning, they had no plans to abandon Nintendo. Nintendo was a long-standing ally. The companies were very close. They trusted each other. And Sony was this upstart who nobody knew if they would be able to pull this off at all. Because they're new to the business. There have been a lot of companies that came in from outside, big consumer electronics and multimedia companies that were like, we can get into this business, and then fell completely on their face. Of course, Sony was very interested in courting Square because Sony did not have robust first-party development. They were going to have to, in the beginning, rely very heavily on third parties. RPGs are very popular in Japan. Final Fantasy is very popular in Japan. They need RPGs. It's not just Square that's not going with them. Enix is also steadfastly loyal to Nintendo and is not budging. Sony is very much of the opinion that if they can get one of those companies to move, that it'll break the floodgates and it will get others to move in their direction as well. So they were very interested in Square. So they met with Square very early on, and Square basically said, well, we're not doing this unless you sell 3 million units. You have to have an install base of 3 million before we will consider working with you, because that's what they figured they would need for break even. Because, 3 million and then whatever their formula was for how many of those users were likely to buy a Final Fantasy game, because obviously it's not going to be 100% attach rate. But their model said that to break even, they needed 3 million sold. Despite the reservations, there was no way in the beginning that they were ever going to break with Nintendo, the sure thing, and go with Sony, the upstart who may fall flat on their face. Because this was going to be expensive. Very expensive. Then Sony did it. Sony sold 3 million. Over a couple of years, not all at once, but they hit that install base. So Sony came back to them and said, okay, we did our part. Now it's your turn. At this point, they'd been doing their tests, they'd been comparing the hardwares, they'd been rendering their polygons, all of this stuff, and had really come to a decision that with the combination of the frame rate issues with high polygon counts and the capacity, the storage issues, and cost issues associated with staying with a raw memory format instead of going to CD, Sakaguchi was convinced that they needed to make the change. As I said, Sakaguchi was practically a god at Square. He was in a very unique position where he could influence the management of the company. Now, the founder, Miyamoto, was no longer the head of the company at this point. At this point, that role was taken by one Tomoyuki Takechi, but Miyamoto was still the largest shareholder. Miyamoto was still the person with whom real power resided, and Miyamoto was going to be the one that made the final decision. Sakaguchi and a couple of other guys met with Miyamoto and said, this Nintendo hardware's not going to work. To achieve our vision, we are going to have to go with Sony. Miyamoto, who trusted Sakaguchi implicitly, said, okay, we'll explore that then. They were given permission, basically. And so Takechi did the actual negotiations then at that point, because they still had to figure out a mutually beneficial deal, and Sony really wanted them. Not only did they want the Final Fantasy series, but they did figure that if they could get Square, then they would be able to use that to land Enix. And so the Dragon Quest series was in their sights as well, not just the Final Fantasy series.
Lo and behold, 7 ends up on the PlayStation.
Yes. Nobody will give the exact terms of the deal, but people that Leone interviewed on both the Sony side and the Square side, including Takechi, said that Sony gave them a very generous deal compared to a lot of other companies, and in particular demanded far less of a royalty rate per unit than they tended to offer other companies. They gave them a sweetheart deal, basically. So that, combined with the technological stuff, meant that Square said goodbye to their close partner Nintendo and took the plunge and joined Sony for Final Fantasy VII.
It really seems like for Sony, it's a retail equivalent of this is a loss leader, where they're willing to take a loss in order to draw people in. They draw in Square, therefore that gives them an air of legitimacy that gets other people going, oh, Square's with them, maybe there's something here about this PlayStation thing that I need to check out.
Exactly, and there is some indication, I mean, this is all a little squishy, but some people have said that they're pretty sure that Square then, not only did Square signing with Sony help push Enix, but that Square actually did some lobbying on Sony's behalf to get Enix to break ranks as well. Nintendo did not speak to Square for years after this break. They were just not welcome anymore. It was a bitter betrayal, but some people speculate that Yamauchi was, while he was upset that Square left, he was far more upset that Square helped lure Enix away. That was the thing that really annoyed him, because not only did Square betray him, but then Square helped another very important company betray him. There's nothing bigger in Japan than Dragon Quest at this time. This is a bit of trivia I love to throw out there sometimes. Best-selling PlayStation 1 game in Japan?
Dragon Quest VII.
And it's not even close. Only one to top 4 million. That was a big deal for Sony, not only getting Square, but getting Enix. They now had the two flagship RPG producers in Japan, and RPGs were big business in Japan. Now let's take a little break from the business shenanigans. We're going to get back to them to talk a little bit about what exactly is this game going to be that is going to show up on this PlayStation hardware. Well, there are a couple of central themes to this. One of them is the central theme of the game itself, which was really defined by Hironobu Sakaguchi. He is no longer involved in the day-to-day so much, but he is still the producer. He's still overseeing the development on a very high level. The theme of this game for Sakaguchi was life.
Life. Don't talk to me about life.
That's right. Sakaguchi had recently lost his mother, and that had got him thinking, in his grief very deeply about what exactly life is, how it starts, how it ends, what happens to us when we die. He was getting very philosophical about all of this stuff in the wake of his mother's death. That informed the theme that he really wanted to explore in Final Fantasy VII, In his own words, this is what he said in a video once. In his own words, he thought about what if life could be thought about mathematically? What if you could take the mysticism out of it? What if you could actually kind of quantify what life force is and how life force works and how life force is transferred? In his own words, he considered it kind of a coping mechanism for the grief he was going through. That's what led them to this idea of the life stream and materia and all of this metaphysical stuff that forms the core of the world in Final Fantasy VII. A lot of people assume quite logically that environmentalism was one of the main themes, because after all, you start in this place where you have this corporation that's draining the planet, and they need to be stopped. Kitase has pushed back against that. Yes, obviously, there's an environmental message there. I mean, that's clearly there. But it was really about life and how life exists in a kind of quantifiable way and the ways that it's necessary to be in harmony with that life force. So the idea of the planet being drained is the idea of kind of not being in harmony with the life force. And then the idea that as the game goes on, you get help from the life stream to overcome the big bad, the big evil, is kind of living in harmony with the life stream and in balance with life. An environmental message naturally comes out of that, but it wasn't their starting point. Their idea was not, let's do a game about environmentalism and how it's important to take care of our planet's resources. That just naturally evolved out of this idea of life and nature and balance that really sprung from Sakaguchi processing his grief, quite frankly, over the death of his mother. That's kind of that starting point. The other kind of big theme comes from Kitase. That is wanting to go in the opposite direction of Final Fantasy VI. Final Fantasy VI comes into this again. Final Fantasy VI was a game where anyone could be the protagonist, was kind of the theme, as we discussed. For this game, he wanted to focus in on a single person and their relationship with a primary antagonist. Instead of everyone being the protagonist, it's no, here's our protagonist, and we want to explore that protagonist's relationship with an antagonist. Of course, that evolves into the Cloud-Sephiroth relationship. He very much wanted this to be an omnipresent through line, a narrative through line through the entire story, the relationship between these two characters. That's what he was interested in doing from a narrative and storytelling perspective. But he was also afraid that if the primary hero, if Cloud, was just encountering Sephiroth all the time, that Sephiroth would lose impact as a big bad. As with anything that looks to be very powerful, very scary, very whatever, the more familiarity you have with something, the more of that mystique it loses. The more you understand something, the less awed you are by something. That's just in life in general, not just in narrative structure.
Think about any time you're scared of something, the more you learn about how it works, you become complacent with familiarity. I don't know about yourself, but I was really afraid when I first learned to drive a car. It was like, this giant machine, how am I going to manage driving it? How can I make sure my attention's focused enough in all the places it needs to be focused?
Well, Jeff, you just have to give a friendly tap of the horn. That's how you overcome that fear.
Oh, right. The Smith system of driving. So many friendly taps of the horn. That would totally go completely safe for me if I were to do that in, I don't know, North St. Louis.
But yes, continue with your point. It's a good point. I just had to get that in there.
As I've gotten more and more used to driving, I became very good at it, so that things that used to scare me a lot, they don't. And then I look at other people being afraid of things, and I'm like, well, how do you afraid of that? And then I have to think back to how it is. When I drove my wife from California out here to where I live now, we went through a blizzard, and I was the one driving. I'm used to driving in blizzards. I've had to do it multiple times. To this day, I will always remember her grabbing my right arm while I'm driving and going, I'm so glad you're driving. Just that kind of stress. We've had family who were visiting who got hit in a recent hurricane that was in Texas.
Yeah.
They were driving in it, and like, I would be, okay, yeah, this is rain, fine, we're going on. They don't have that familiarity dealing with driving through rain and bad weather, so they're going, okay, we got to pull over and find a hotel.
Indeed. He wanted this to be an omnipresent relationship, but he didn't want the antagonist, became Sephiroth, appearing all the time because Sephiroth would lose the mystique. And so that's how the game kind of evolved into this chase of Sephiroth across the world. That's not the entire game, but the vast majority of the game is just chasing Sephiroth across the world. The reason for that is always just being one step behind, always having him be just out of reach, builds a mystique to the character. But then they also had the opportunity to have these little set pieces that kind of gave a preview of his power, like when he murders President Shinra, and you don't see the murder, you just see the aftermath. There's this bloody trail leading from Hojo's lab all the way up to the president's office, and there's the president slumped over his desk with a sword in his back. Then a little later on with the Midgar Zolom, this big snake creature that lives in the marshes, you're told that this creature is too powerful, you won't be able to kill it, you need to use a chocobo that can move fast enough to avoid the Zolom. And so, that's what you do. You rent a chocobo and you cross the swamp and you avoid the Zolom. And then at the end, when you get to the cave that takes you to the next area, there's a cutscene, and there's the big, scary Midgar Zolom that you've been told you cannot defeat, dead, impaled on a tree. And it's Sephiroth that did it.
There's a lot of things where there's flashbacks showing his power as a younger, weaker Cloud is interacting with him.
Exactly.
There's all these other things because you have these Genova clones of Sephiroth running around doing random things. You start realizing, wait, I'm not even really dealing with Sephiroth. I'm just dealing with clones of him that are probably weaker. Oh, crap.
Genova cells.
I'm scared now.
Exactly. Yeah, and that was entirely intentional. That was, again, it's Kitase, the filmmaker, figuring out what he considered the best way to maintain a narrative tension while still developing this antagonistic relationship between these two characters. Sakaguchi's concept of life and how does life work and how can life force be measured scientifically, combined with Kitase's idea of I want to have a story that is very focused on a central character and their antagonistic relationship with the villain, is really the two things that come together to shape the Final Fantasy VII experience. Kind of the third leg of that, I guess you could call it, is kind of the general world building that grows up around these concepts, which was primarily the province of the art director of the game, Yusuke Naora, which I'm sure I horribly mispronounced, but that's okay. Once again, a lot of this came down to wanting to subvert tropes a little bit. Obviously, Sephiroth is the primary antagonist in the end, but looking at other antagonists to have in the game, they were thinking that RPGs had become very stale and very trite when it came to their villains. Yeah, you had some interesting villains like Kefka that had, dimensions to them. I mean, I love Kefka too, don't get me wrong, but it's always this big dragon or this big monster or this powerful wizard or this guy that comes into possession of some powerful artifact and decides to blow up the world.
Yes, we are the evil ones, as I twirl my mustache, and I will tie the maiden to the track and blow them up with the stick of dynamite with this convenient ticking clock. There's something nice about a ticking clock. It has this ring to it, this dark ring to it. It just goes tick, tock, tick, tock. You don't really have gentleman villains anymore, just being evil for evil's sake. You want to be able to relate to your villain because in real life, no one thinks of themselves as the bad guy. We're always the protagonist or the person who's trying to do the right thing in our own way. It might be wrong compared to a lot of other people. A lot of people don't go, I'm waking up this morning and I'm putting on my evil pants and I'm going to go out and do the thing of evil. Like bank robber, you think back to the Wild West, Jesse James, other ones. They weren't doing it because, I can be evil. They were doing it because they were like, I got a bad lot in life. I need to be able to survive. I'm going to rob this bank from people who obviously have way more. They're not going to be missing it as much. And it helps me and the people I care about. That's how bad guys work.
Everyone is the hero of their own story.
Exactly.
Some people are just insane.
There is that too.
Some people do just want to watch the world burn. But the majority of people, yes, are coming from some place that's real, even if it's disconnected from everyone else's reality.
And then the most interesting villains are those that you can relate to, where you can be like, I can really understand how they get that way. You want to see that in really good action? Breaking Bad with Walter White.
Oh, absolutely.
The first season versus the last season. First season, husband, loving husband, wants to try and make ends meet with all this cancer and other stuff going on. By the end, he's like,
I am the danger.
Exactly. Watching that fall from grace there, you don't just put on your pants and go evil, or no one starts out doing really nasty things compared to everything else. It is definitely a slippery slope where you just do, I can step over the line a little bit for this thing. Well, then that moves the line a little bit. Well, I already did that. There's no real consequences. Let's continue on, and on. Sin by 1,000 paper cuts.
Indeed. So they didn't want to do another dragon, another wizard, another powerful artifact, and so they decided the one thing that had been really underused was a corporation as an evil entity, in an RPG situation. Now, obviously, there have been evil corporations in media before, but in an RPG situation, that really hadn't been done. So they came up with the idea of the Shinra Electric Power Company, which kind of, to your point, they feel like they're making the world a better place. Yes, they're greedy. They're doing it because they like making the money, and they're also implementing a totalitarian government, and there's bad stuff going on, but also they're bringing something to the people that they haven't had before. And while they're partially motivated by greed, they don't see providing this resource to the people as a strictly evil thing, despite the fact that it's destroying the planet. They want to lead humanity into a new promised land. And yes, they want to be in control of that promised land. They're not doing it for altruistic reasons, but kind of a rising tide lifts all boats, or maybe if you're feeling less generous, a Reaganomics-style trickle-down effect. If they reach the promised land, then all of humanity is going to benefit, even if they benefit more. A corporation naturally kind of lends itself to an idea of a more modern setting. So they put in a lot of steampunk. Again, Final Fantasy VI was already going in a heavily steampunk direction. There was a castle that could burrow under the ground and move between continents, for God's sake. They were also going in a little bit of a cyberpunk direction. However, Nora, the art director, felt it was important that they didn't get too cyberpunk with it, because it was still a world of magic. So there was still this idea that in a world of magic, there'll also be some technology, but you're not going to have as much futuristic technology in a world of magic as a world without magic, just because magic allows you to easily do some of the things that it might be a little harder to do with technology, even though it's achievable. So he was trying to strike a balance between a futuristic cyberpunk aesthetic, a steampunk aesthetic, and traditional medieval fantasy aesthetic. Was kind of the goal that he was going for. And so what the art team ended up basically doing was a mishmash, which makes it sound kind of horrible, but it's not. They did a wide variety of environments, some of which felt very contemporary. And they even took inspiration from Tokyo and the part of Tokyo where Square was located. And then other parts that were more fantasy or medieval inspired, and other parts that were more high technology inspired. And they kind of mashed that all together to create a very unique world, quite frankly. Far different from much of anything that you had seen in a JRPG to that point, at least, which most of them were still adhering to a medieval base, or in the case of something like Phantasy Star, a sci-fi Star Wars kind of base. Even though there were some futuristic ones and some contemporary ones and some medieval ones, they were all grounded in a single kind of base way of being, whereas Final Fantasy VII just kind of explodes in all directions, and in the process, I think, creates something unique in terms of its world building.
Final Fantasy has always had the situation of having high technology in its game, even going back to 1.
Yes.
And it comes from them loving the concept of, this isn't the first time civilization has arisen and gotten really far advanced.
Right.
I really like the idea with 7 where, in a way, this is sort of what happened is like, okay, we have a medieval society that's advancing, and then someone manages to effectively go through the Industrial Revolution into the modern era almost, and post-industrial era, in the span of, let's say, 25 years.
Right.
Imagine going from medieval Renaissance Europe to about 50 years ago.
Yeah.
In a span of 25 years. You're compressing several, 400 years to 25 years. Just imagine the mishmash of how society would be. You'd have what you have in Final Fantasy VII. Places where they really embrace the new technology. They're really advanced. There are all sorts of crazy things. They're doing their stuff. But you're going to have outlying villages that are barely more advanced than straw huts and water wheels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. You're absolutely correct that some of that goes back to the very beginning of Final Fantasy. It's also this idea that we want something more modern like a corporation and a technology base, but we want that to be in a setting that is still magic, so we don't want it to just purely be cyberpunk or futuristic. It's that blending, as you said, that really makes the setting quite interesting. That's kind of where all of that stuff goes. I mean, the RPG side of it is still actually pretty traditional, almost painfully so, because the random encounter rate is so high. They weren't breaking as much ground on the gameplay side, but where they were really breaking ground was on the presentation side. And even in those battles, I mean, the battles themselves are pretty traditional turn-based Final Fantasy battles that are basically the same as they've been ever since the ATB system was introduced in Final Fantasy IV. Again, it's that cinematic flair that Kitase was going for, and this is, again, Kitase's influence. Rather than it being a static battle screen, the way it had always been in previous Final Fantasies, where, you know, you're on the right and the enemy's on the left and just enter your commands and everything, the camera swooped around that battlefield. I mean, you were still in the basic configuration of the parties on the right and the enemies are on the left, but the camera would zoom in and rotate around someone that was a monster that was doing a cast, or just dynamically move around the field. And again, it was trying to give this idea that this is something more cinematic than has really ever been attempted in a console RPG before.
You want to see a really cinematic fight? Just summon Knights of the Round.
Yes, and they were also very excited that they would be able to fully realize summons for the first time. And they went all out on that. One could argue a little too all out. The animations are wonderful. There just should have been an option to skip them after you saw them the first time. Especially Knights of the Round. Oh my goodness. And at least Knights of the Round did a lot of damage. Then, of course, you have Sephiroth's thing where he blows up the entire solar system and does like 500 damage.
Solar system, galaxy, stuff happened, things died.
Yeah.
Oh, I just have a little boo-boo here. Let us just cure one that for you. Proceed on.
You know, you have this cinematic direction by Kitase. You have some of these overall themes from Sakaguchi. You have Nora and his team defining the art of the world. Tetsuya Nomura is the main character designer, drawing a lot from anime influences. And for the first time, you know, in the past, they would have Yoshitaka Amano do a bunch of concept art. That concept art wouldn't be directly imported into a Final Fantasy game, but they would use Amano's art as kind of their window into what the characters and the setting would look like, and then the sprite artists would use that as a base and create from there. This time, because of the CG and the polygonal world, it was the exact opposite, where Nomura was actually defining the look of the characters, and then Amano was still involved in creating concept art, but Amano was basing his art on what the game designers were doing. So it was kind of a flipping of the script there. And then you had a story, which again was very collaborative, because this is a long game with a lot of episodic content, and just like in Final Fantasy VI, Kitase solicited ideas from everybody, and then the head scenario writer on the game, Kazushige Nojima, took all of those ideas and crafted them and molded them into a coherent story. So those were some of the main people involved, and then of course Kazuyuki Hashimoto was leading the CG side of things. Those were kind of the main people involved, but this was a game created by a huge team. At the time, most games were still being created by 20 or 30 people. Square had been throwing more people at games for a while, like Final Fantasy VI, I think, had like 60 people working on it, which was incredibly big. Final Fantasy VII had somewhere between 150 and 200 people working on it. Most of that was just the programmers and artists and 3D rendering specialists that they needed to realize this vision in 3D with polygons and CG cutscenes and all of that kind of stuff. This was kind of the last time for a while that Japan could do something like this, because the Japanese game industry was ridiculously profitable in the 90s. At the beginning of the 90s, you'd had the collapse of the bubble economy in Japan. That had had a very bad effect on many segments of the Japanese economy, but a lot of those people that ended up unemployed or underemployed after the collapse of the bubble economy were spending a lot of time gaming to forget about their problems. And I've seen this from a couple of different Japanese developers have talked about this. I mean, I'm not just pulling this out of thin air. This is something that people that were involved in the Japanese business at the time say. So the collapse of the bubble economy actually, paradoxically, led to a surge of growth in the Japanese video game industry because there was so much money pouring in. This is what allowed Square at this period in its history, because Square isn't the biggest player in the industry. Not even close, but even a company like Square in this kind of overheated environment has the money coming in that they can just suddenly expand up to something like this. Doesn't end up being sustainable for a lot of reasons, but like the 90s was kind of a high watermark in the Japanese industry's ability to do something like this. So they hired 150, 200 people. They bought 200 Silicon Graphics workstations. I mean, they just poured everything into this sucker to make sure it was as advanced as it possibly could be, and as cinematic as it possibly could be, following Kitase's vision. That is really the catalyst for kind of the final thing we'll talk about here in this look at the game, is its important role in cementing a place for Sony in the North American market and cementing a place for Japanese console RPGs, which up to this point had been miserable performers in the American market. Just as Sony was very interested in luring Square to their stable, they were also very interested once they saw how Final Fantasy VII was shaping up. Actually, I have no idea at what point in the process it was. I don't know if they saw it shaping up or just had a lot of faith in Square, because I don't know the exact timeline. They were very keen on being the one to bring that game to the rest of the world as the publisher. Sony wanted to publish the game in the United States, in Europe. At this time, Sony had not really had a big hit abroad yet. There had not been a game yet, according to the people that were interviewed. I haven't backstopped this by looking at numbers myself, but we'll just go with it. There had not been a game yet that had sold 1 million units in North America on the PlayStation. While the PlayStation was doing okay in the United States, as soon as the N64 hit the US in September 1996, it immediately started outselling the PlayStation. Now, there were still more PlayStation units out overall because the PlayStation had had a year head start, but the N64 was closing the gap rapidly. There were still a lot of gamers that were really nostalgic for Nintendo, that really loved Nintendo properties. Mario 64, of course, was an amazing game, so everyone was interested in having a piece of that. And a lot of the initial PlayStation lineup just wasn't as exciting to a Western audience. I mean, there were some hits on there that appealed to the West, like Tomb Raider, but there was still a very strong preference for Nintendo amongst North American consumers, and the N64 was outselling the PlayStation. Sony had not had they'd had a couple of small hits, but they had not had a big hit in North America yet. They saw Final Fantasy VII as a way to perhaps reverse that.
You have to remember here, and Alex and I grew up during this time. You're a young kid. Your first console was probably the original 8-bit NES.
Mm-hmm.
You enjoy the heck out of that thing. You enjoy it. Wow, I'm a little bit older. Here's the Super Nintendo. Fantastic. I'm enjoying it. I'm becoming a tween, 12, 13-year-old. Oh, along comes the N64. Nintendo has been good to me for 2 generations here. Why wouldn't they be great for me going forward?
Yeah, and have you seen that Mario game? Mario 64?
Oh, yeah. You see the Mario 64 game. You see the Star Fox game. You see Ocarina of Time coming down the pipeline. Okay, Nintendo's hitting it out of the park again. here's my money.
Exactly. So Sony was not in dire straits. I mean, it's not like the PlayStation was failing, but they were definitely at risk of losing their market advantage. And nobody knew at the time that Nintendo was going to end up shooting themselves in the foot by not releasing enough games for the N64. I mean, at this time, it was looking a little bit grim. So Sony made a deal to be the publisher. They signed, I think, a 6-game deal with Square. It wasn't the only game. But they signed a deal with Square to be the publisher in the West. And most importantly, this also meant that they put a lot of money into a joint marketing campaign.
Merchandising.
Yeah. Now, you might ask yourself, okay, JRPGs have never done well in the West. We've talked about how Minoru Arakawa was convinced that both Dragon Warrior and Final Fantasy would be a great hits in the United States if only they could get American players used to them. And he was wrong.
There's a reason there's Final Fantasy Mystic Quest on the Super Nintendo.
Right. We've seen Square decide that they need to release an easy game. Oh, if only we could get them acclimated to RPGs they'd understand. And that failed. We've seen Enix pull out of the North American market entirely at this point, not even releasing Dragon Quest V or VI.
5 being my favorite one.
Indeed. We've seen Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger take Japan by storm and just sell practically nothing in the US. So why? Why are they taking this chance here? I think it comes down to the fact that I think they saw the cinematic elements and the dramatic story elements as being a fundamental break from what came before. You can see that in the marketing. One thing that people that talked to Leon talked about that were at Square USA at the time is they said, we told Sony, don't call it an RPG. Because RPGs had a reputation in the West, based on Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy games primarily, and the few others that came out, of being slow, dull, repetitive, full of reading of too much dialogue, and not enough action going on for the American audience. You know, they told Sony, in your marketing, don't call it an RPG. What they did, instead of focusing on the gameplay, you look at the commercials, and those commercials were everywhere. They were in movie theaters. I remember seeing the commercial before a movie in a movie theater. They were everywhere. In those commercials, they emphasized the dramatic story beats. They emphasized things like the scene in Nibelheim in the flashback where Sephiroth is walking away in the fire. They're emphasizing things like the ginormity of the city of Midgar. They're emphasizing these fantastic locations and these dramatic story moments instead of typical RPG gameplay. I'm not even sure, I mean, I don't know this for certain, but I'm not even sure you even see a turn-based battle in any of these commercials.
Bouncing through them, it's all really just cutscenes and dramatic things. You're a soldier of fortune, and you got Cloud on a motorcycle going by on American. I'm like, soldier of fortune, you say.
Motorcycle, you say.
Giant sword and motorcycle, you say. Guy with some sort of giant gun for his hand, you say.
Exactly. They did a big blitz in the magazines of the day, too. Again, in those, they were emphasizing the cutscenes and the graphics. So there was a feeling that if they could get people invested in the cinematic sweep of it all and the story of it all, that people would kind of not even pay attention to the fact that they're actually playing an RPG. It's like hiding the vegetables in the pizza crust or something, you know? It's like, if we do this right, they won't even realize they're eating their vegetables. And it's kind of the same thing with the approach to Final Fantasy VII.
I know my parents got me to eat all my broccoli by putting copious amounts of cheese on it.
Exactly. You know, it's they're emphasizing the cheese and they're not emphasizing the broccoli.
At Big Jeffrey's Food Emporium, we have cheese. All the cheese you want to put on all of those vegetables. What's great about cheese is that you can have string cheese, gooey cheese, yellow cheese, white cheese, all the color cheese, but we don't have any vegetables that you can actually taste. Come down to Big Jeffrey's Food Emporium for all of your cheese and barely any vegetables that you would have to eat.
Indeed. And so it was kind of presenting the RPG in a new way. There was a population of children that was ready for something that was still somewhat familiar to their childhood, that was not too adult, but was more adult than the fare that they were used to. These are the same kids that are about ready to discover anime in large numbers for the first time. Final Fantasy VII, I mean, I looked into that. It's like, can we attribute Final Fantasy VII's success to the beginning of kind of the anime craze in the US? And it's like, no, not really, because they're really hitting at the same time. What really brings anime into the mainstream in the US is Pokemon and the Toonami block at Cartoon Network. Both of those are still in the future when Final Fantasy is released in 1997. The first Toonami block is hit, but it's not an anime block. It's not till 1999 that Toonami embraces anime. It's not quite the anime craze that is going to fuel Final Fantasy VII here, but I think it's the same instincts that fueled the anime craze. Because you had a generation of kids that grew up on Saturday morning cartoons and syndicated cartoons based on toy lines like G.I. Joe and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and that kind of thing. While these cartoons could sometimes be interesting, they were constrained in the types of drama they could show, the types of violence they could show, the types of stories they could tell. Then anime came along, and obviously some people knew about anime all along here. I mean, there was always an underground scene, but it mainstreamed at the end of the 90s. I'm drawing a distinction here between the underground scene and the mainstream scene. Anime came along, and you had serialized storytelling with complex characters, mature plots, and yeah, some of it was still aimed at children, and some of it was still a little silly, but compared to American cartoons, it felt very adult and sophisticated. So you had kids that grew up on American cartoons that became teenagers and were looking for something a little more adult, but weren't necessarily totally ready to leave their childhoods behind. And anime kind of, I think, hit a sweet spot for that generation of kids when it started showing up at the end of the 90s in the US in a more mainstream way. I think Final Fantasy VII probably hit in the same way. Because that's what all the reviews focused in on, too. It's like incredible graphics, complex characters, amazing story. Everyone was salivating over that. Nobody was really salivating over the fact that, oh my god, it's a JRPG, and we have turn-based combat, and oh my god, there are so many encounters, and why is the encounter rate tuned so high? Nobody was paying attention to that part of it. They were just kind of swept up in the grander elements. There were emotional moments in it. I mean, of course, one thing we haven't talked about, and, spoiler alert for, 20-plus-year-old game, nearly 30-year-old game at this point.
December 97, I want to say?
Yeah, 97. There's a major character death in it. The death of Aerith. That was Nomura. Even though Nojima was in charge of the snare and Kitase was the director, they took ideas from everywhere. And Nomura basically said, we have a game with the theme of life. In order for the idea of life to be impactful, we have to have some death as a counterbalance to life to kind of reinforce the theme of the preciousness of life. So it was Nomura's idea that they kill off Aerith in order to provide that extra oomph and feeling around the sanctity of life that was the theme of the game. Even though if you look at that cutscene today, obviously it's blocky characters and, it's very primitive, but it was shocking and it moved people. There were people that cried when Aerith died. Electronic Arts had asked back in 1983, can a computer make you cry? And Final Fantasy VII was one of the first times that the answer was yes. I think the audience was ready for a sophisticated cinematic story in video game form, regardless of the genre. The genre almost didn't matter, which is why the fact that it was a JRPG was fine with people. Then the other thing is, it was the nascent internet. And it was a game that was complex in its plot, with all the clones running around and weapons and the planets and materia and all of this. But as big as they were able to make it, they had to take some shortcuts in the storytelling and in the dialogue and everything, just because they are constrained by the amount of space that they have to work with, even something as ginormous as a CD. So there's a lot of stuff that is fairly ambiguous in the game. Players were very intrigued by this and were intrigued by the larger world, intrigued by the characters, and also, say, desperate to find a super secret way to bring Aerith back into their party. People were really drawn to discussing this game with their friends and other people. with the internet kind of coming into its first full bloom, this also translated to a lot of people going online and going to forums and writing fan fiction and sharing art. It's like the game came along and attracted a fandom at just the point where it became much easier to connect with other people in your fandom around the country and around the world via the internet. So I think when you put all of those things together, that's why you ended up with Final Fantasy VII becoming an absolute phenomenon. I mean, it sold around 10 million units worldwide. It did become the first million selling, according to the people in the interviews, the first million selling PlayStation game in the United States. And it sold more in the United States than it did in Japan. A JRPG that not only finally becomes successful in the United States, but sells more in the United States than it does in Japan.
Pretty phenomenal for an RPG. Really, like we said, Dragon Quest never did really well in the US. Final Fantasy never did well in the United States. That's why Final Fantasy skipped 2 and 3 on the NES before coming out with 4/2 in the United States. Skips 5, goes to 6/3. And then we just have all the numbering weirdness. Dragon Quest goes, I'm going to do the first 4 games, tease 5, and then we're going to be like, well, you're not buying my games. So I'm taking these and going home. It's crazy.
After this, Japanese RPGs are immensely, it's not a flash in the pan or a fluke, they become immensely popular in the United States. I do think that that's, it's the storytelling. Just as anime is going to start resonating in the same period, just as manga are going to start resonating with the same period. It turns out that there is a hunger amongst the youth in the United States for more sophisticated storytelling in visual media, like video games, comic books, cartoons, than American companies were willing to give them. Once they were dialed into that deep storytelling, they were just completely hooked, and I don't think the mechanics even mattered anymore. I think JRPGs probably before, they didn't have compelling enough storytelling. You and I loved them, and obviously other people did too, but for the vast majority of the audience, they didn't want to read reams of text, just static text. It's not that they had to read, it's that there was no interesting action accompanying that reading. They didn't want to be in relatively static turn-based battles.
Which I completely can understand for that kind of thing, but for myself, I've always loved stories. Stories are a great thing for me.
Yeah.
As a kid, I would read all sorts of different things and imagine these worlds that I could get into. And then when I discovered RPGs, I wasn't playing them because the mechanics. I barely understood the mechanics. I still barely understand the mechanics of most of these games.
Right.
I play them because I want to experience the story, and you can only do that through the game.
Exactly.
For me, at least, the games, the mechanics, or whatever, the twinking it to whatever, has no interest to me. I'm just playing it for the story. I'm going through to figure out what's the next thing. What's the next thing? Oh, I have to get to this strong in order to beat this bad guy in order to get to the next part of the story? All right, we'll be doing that because I want to know the next bit.
Exactly. And I was the same way. And I think most people are that way. I mean, yes, there are people that like to twink and min-max, and there's nothing wrong with being that person. But I think the majority of people play these kinds of games for the story. But I think that for the majority of people as well, they didn't want to just be engaging with a relatively static experience, static text, static battles. That was enough for you and I, but it wasn't enough for the mainstream. I think the people that finally discovered Final Fantasy VII, it's just like you and me. It's like, we're not doing this for the RPG mechanics, we're doing it for the story. It's just that they needed a more dramatically presented story to get that same level of enjoyment out of it that you and I did on the 8-bit and 16-bit systems.
They really needed to have something that could really draw them in better than stuff that you and I were interested in. Reading for you and me, who were bookworms when we were kids,
right?
This is not even really a true book. Looks over at large 500-page book. Yes, your pathetic game is nothing in Textland to me, mortal.
And that's not to denigrate anybody at all.
No, it's just a different way of going about things.
Yeah, right. I mean, television today is more popular than reading books, and that's fine. It takes all types of people. That's not to denigrate anyone who prefers one medium over another or one type of experience over the other. It's just It's very clear from the Final Fantasy experience that what was needed to get a mainstream acceptance was something that was more exciting and dynamic and less static. The combination of having a budding filmmaker like Kitase at the head of the project, in conjunction with the technology moving forward and progressing enough that the vision of someone like Kitase could be realized through the work of people like Kazuyuki Hashimoto working on these advanced workstations from Silicon Graphics, that made the popularity of the JRPG in the West a reality and turned the Final Fantasy series into a worldwide phenomenon instead of just a minor Japanese hit RPG series.
We've done it again, Alex. We've talked for 2 hours about a single video game, and we barely touched on the plot.
Indeed. Well, it'll cut down to a little less than 2 hours for the people, but that's really all there is that we need to cover on this. The creation, the people involved, the reasons for the creative choices taken, and why I think that it became a breakout worldwide success when previous JRPGs had not. I think that's pretty good for this one.
If you have not experienced Final Fantasy VII, certainly at the very least watch a Let's Play of it. If you feel so inclined, there's the remake of it, there's the original games. Experience it. It is certainly something to experience to try and really understand what was going on and try to put yourself back of how people might have thought back in 97, 98, experiencing this for the first time. Before then, all you had as far as RPGs were is pixel art. Good pixel art, but pixel art.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think back to, Final Fantasy VI, because I think at the end of the day, I like Final Fantasy VI more than Final Fantasy VII. They're very close to me. But even as much as I love Final Fantasy VI, boy, do I often think I wish they had maybe made this one for the PlayStation and we got some of that dramatic. Even someone like me who's fine with the reading and with the pixel art and whatnot is like, but wouldn't it have been great if Final Fantasy VI had been made like Final Fantasy VII?
So after Square Enix is done with this remake of Final Fantasy VII and gets it out the door, we need to get them to sit down and do a remake of 6.
Exactly.
Imagine the horrors of Kefka in that one.
Indeed.
Speaking of horrors, what shall we be discussing in our next episode?
I actually came up with this. I had a completely different direction that I was going to go for the next episode, which we'll still get to, so I won't say what that was now. But something that I realized when I was doing the research on this is that Final Fantasy VII was extremely influential. It transformed the worldwide popularity of the JRPG. It was definitive in helping Sony move ahead of Nintendo for good and achieve dominance in that console generation and beyond. It broke new narrative ground. It was incredibly influential. And you know what, Jeffrey? We did not put it on our list of top 100 influential games when we did our 3-part episode several years ago.
No one's perfect.
What I consider the top 100 influential games is going to change on a day-by-day, week-by-week, year-by-year basis, just depending on my mood or what I remember or how the industry has continued to evolve. So, it's not really an oversight per se, but it got me thinking that we did that list several years ago, and it probably makes sense to revisit this, not in the exact same format, not as a 3-parter again. We live streamed that one as well, and just in the sense of going back to that list, re-examining it, seeing some of the choices we made, and seeing how maybe our opinions have changed just based on the last several years of continued industry evolution. So I was thinking that we might do a top 100 influential games redux, probably 2 episodes instead of 3 this time, and not in the exact same format. Something a little talking about influential games, but also being a little meta and discussing why or why not the first time around did we go with some of these games. I thought that might be a fun couple of lighthearted episodes here to do for a little change of pace.
Not revisions and updates 4?
No, it won't be that. It's top 100 games redux.
Okay, so we're going to see how that list changed, what we're going to add, what we're going to remove, why things change. Maybe you can voice your own opinion on it. Who knows? Next time on They Create Worlds. Check out our show notes at podcast.theycreateworlds.com, where we have linked to some of the things that we discussed in this and other episodes. You can check out Alex's video game history blog at videogamehistorian.wordpress.com. Alex's book, They Create Worlds, The People and Companies That Shape the Video Game Industry, Volume 1, can now be ordered through CRC Press and at major online retailers. Email us at feedback@theycreateworlds.com. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/theycreateworlds. You can also help by getting the word out by leaving a review on your favorite podcasting service. We now have the podcast available on YouTube. Intro music is Airplane Mode by Josh Woodward, found at joshwoodward.com/song/airplane mode, used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. But in this case, we used the Final Fantasy VII intro, so please don't sue us. We use it in love in very short periods, and it's owned by Square Enix. So it's all theirs. It's all there. No claim to it whatsoever. Outro music is Bacterial Love by Rolla Music, found at freemusicarchive.org, used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Now go play Final Fantasy VII, kids. Or any Final Fantasy VII. Really, just double 7 and get 14. And play that.